Your work often centers on different forms of political control. I'd like to start by asking you what brought you to that as a central topic of research?
Um, I grew up feeling that I was a guinea pig in an experiment that nobody talked about. I just had this feeling for a long time, and started off talking about sexual issues, because I felt that they were important. And once I had enough background, about 20 years of experience, I put it together in a book called Libido Dominandi. And over the course of that book, I realized that every instance that I was dealing with was a form of control. Uh, that Libido Dominandi could also be considered a history of modern psychology. So it was Freudian psychology, it was behaviorism, and then it was third way. Each of those instances, they were all forms of control. Sigmund Freud used to try to get rich Americans, lure them onto the psychiatrist's couch so that he could extort money from them. The story of Horace Frink is a classic example of that. An American doctor who went over to become a psychoanalyst. During the course of his psychoanalysis, he mentioned that he was having an affair with one of his patients. Sigmund Freud at that point said, well, divorce your wife, marry this woman, and then make a large contribution to the Psychoanalytic Society. Obviously, behaviorism was always conceived as a form of control, of sort of technology. And the third way, Carl Rogers, that group of people, we pioneered that story, which was basically how Carl Rogers, after Vatican II, wrecked the Immaculate Heart nuns in Los Angeles as a way of renewing them using sensitivity group. So it all came together in the sexual realm with Libido Dominandi. And then around the same time, I wrote Slaughter of Cities, which is about social engineering. That term is actually used there. I'm the first guy who ever said that sexual liberation was a form of social engineering, but this is the social engineers themselves. In particular, Gunnar Myrdal, the big book he wrote or claimed to write, it was actually written by the psychological warfare establishment about racism. That was about the destruction of neighborhoods under the guise of urban renewal. I called it a form of ethnic cleansing. It's a story that is still struggling to get out. I just did a review of Ta-Nehisi Coates' latest book about the Obama years. He talks about Chicago, and he's clear he doesn't know a thing that he's talking about. He's still trying to apply the old, tired formula of white racism as the root of all evil. It doesn't apply in Chicago. It just doesn't apply. He doesn't know what he's talking about because the whole story of social engineering may be in this book, but it still hasn't gotten out into the mainstream of our culture. This finally, after maybe 10, 20 years after I wrote these books, I finally stumbled across Michel Foucault. And this is all that Michel Foucault was talking about, except that he got it exactly wrong. He got it the exact opposite way. So the fundamental issue with Michel Foucault, the biographical issue, was his epiphany, which he called his pact with the devil. That's his term. When he took LSD in Death Valley while he was teaching at Berkeley. And he came up with the formula, which is basically the formula for the New Left, which is still in existence today. It's the operating system of all of our universities, which is basically, if you give us sexual liberation, we won't criticize your economic system. I gave that talk in Berlin a little over a year ago, and it was my first attempt to try and apply this to Germany in light of what I experienced there during the 1970s when I was a teacher there at a German gymnasium. This was the era of the Baader-Meinhof insurrection, the Rote Armee Fraktion insurrection, and basically the authorities discovered that about 80% of the people would put up a member of the Baader-Meinhof gang, had a huge pool of sympathy there with these people, and they drained this swamp by flooding the country with pornography. This is at around the same time that they did it in Portugal, 1974, when Salazar died. Carlucci, what was his first name? I forget the guy's first name. Anyway, the CIA guy who was in charge of the operation in Portugal flooded that country with pornography. I've given talks all over the world about what the Israelis did to the Palestinians when they invaded Ramallah in 2002. So pretty much that is pretty much the summary of about 20 to 30 years of various research leading me to the conclusion that sexual liberation is a form of political control. And nothing that I've learned since that time has convinced me that I made a mistake when I made the statement first 20 years ago.